This episode is brought to you by the Bell and Blank Center at the University of Iowa at bellandblank.org, with programs and resources to support neurodivergent students and their families.
How do we help people thrive?
Yeah.
And I think more often than not, rather than solving your problem, is learning how to be aware and learning how to be able to tolerate frustration as part of the human experience. And I think that's something that we actually do very little of culturally these days.
What does it take to make a counseling practice neurodiversity affirming? What do we need the wider mental health community to understand or embrace in order to better support neurodivergent people? Dr. Andy Kahn is here, and our conversation covers a lot of this ground, so stay with us. It's all ahead on episode 154. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and this is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
What is neurodiversity?
You see the world differently.
Autism spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dysgraphia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity
Podcast.
I just want to remind you that we are continuing to add curriculum to our new Neurodiversity University. We're releasing the second course, Foundations of Dyslexia for Educators, right now. It's a 4+ hour multimedia course, and it includes videos, activities, and discussions, as well as case studies. We're trying to make all of our courses for educators great for professional development and continuing education credit, and this one is no exception. A certificate of completion is provided at the end. If you want more information on Foundations of Dyslexia for Educators, click the link in the show notes or go to neurodiversity.university. We'll bring on Dr. Andy Kahn in just a minute.
When I found the Neurodiversity podcast, I was really kind of
desperate to learn about myself and understand myself.
And understand my kids. And honestly, I wanted to find like a
tribe who I could relate to and feel like I fit in.
This podcast brings on guests who seem to be moving neurodiversity more
into the mainstream. And Emily Kircher-Morris is amazing.
I feel like she's talking straight to me sometimes.
Her knowledge about people who think differently is so refreshing. Everyone's different.
And the world needs to
understand them. And that's what
the Neurodiversity podcast is doing.
Helping them understand
us.
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 Today, I'm excited to welcome Dr. Andrew Kahn to the podcast. Andy is a licensed psychologist and the Associate Director of Behavior Change and Expertise for Understood.org. So, Andy, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
Andy, you and I have actually gotten to know each other throughout the last year because we have been participating in a peer consultation group for neurodiversity-affirming clinicians. So we get a chance to meet monthly via Zoom and talk about how we, as therapists, can provide neurodiversity-affirming care to our clients and help move forward the neurodiversity movement. So I'm always curious just about how different people conceptualize neurodiversity. So what does that concept really mean to you?
So the idea of, maybe before defining neurodiversity, the whole idea of talking about things like normalcy is one of those areas for me that's always been sort of a buzzword. So the idea of talking about, well, what's normal? What's expected? And the idea about being neurodiverse is, for me, sort of one of the first terms of inclusion. The idea that everybody has variability in how they're wired, in how they approach information, learning, their own experiences, so to speak. So if you're going to be competent in working with people and understanding humans as a matter of speaking, having the ability to look at neurodiversity as looking at the scope and range of how humans process information, learn, interact, socialize, the whole 9 yards. So for me, neurodiversity probably came into my consciousness when I first started working really deeply with the population of folks with autism spectrum disorders, and really talking about more helping them navigate a world that wasn't typically wired the same way that they were. So it really sort of encouraged me to see the world from as many angles as I could, or to try to be as compassionate and as aware of how other people process information as a daily part of what I do.
Mm-hmm.
So when the terminology first started being shared, neurodiversity, I'm like, first thought was, well, duh. It seems so intuitive in the sense of if you're really trying to understand and get to know people from their experience, then that's a necessary sort of terminological essential, so to speak.
Yeah. My awareness of neurodiversity and how I support clients has changed quite a bit just over the last decade. How else would you say your path to embracing the neurodiversity affirming paradigm, like how has that influenced your work? What has that progression really been like?
One of the challenging pieces is that as a psychologist, I had a disconnect from my field from the moment I started working in it, in that it's a problem-focused industry. There's something wrong with you. There's something that needs fixing. There's something you need to do differently. And that whole idea, even to the basic aspect of how you get paid.
Right.
You need to have a diagnosis code. You need to identify something in the world of pathology in order to value your work for reimbursement. So from a wellness perspective, I was always of the mindset of how can we live better? How is living better part of what we do as clinical folks, as parents? So I think that sort of guided my journey in terms of how do I help the people that I work with and live amongst to be more successful in a world that doesn't do things the same way they do, or doesn't even see them or perceive them in the same way. And then the balancing act. How do I help the neurodivergent person understand that the world is inflexible to you and that where can you find your way to be successful? And also the greater message. Emily, when you think about what we do, you do a podcast, I do podcasts, I go out and I talk to media. And I'm finding that for me, impact also includes how do we help the world understand better how differences come into play in day-to-day life? And perhaps learning from those differences to say, we could probably accommodate and tweak the world we're living in a lot more easily than forcing all these people to change due to some random diagnosis or identification.
Or some arbitrary expectation that we've put into the social construct of, this is the way things are done. It's like, why?
Exactly. The weakest explanation is always, well, because we've always done it that way.
Right.
And then I sort of chuckle, bite my lip and say, well, how's that working out for you? Bringing out Dr. Phil, which I don't love to do, but that's the idea. It's just, I always love to make people reflect on, okay, if we don't have a good reason, then what's our motivation to keep it this way?
For what it's worth, I think neurodivergent people in general are really good at seeing those logical fallacies.
Oh, yeah.
Like, this just doesn't make sense. And questioning those things, which sometimes can be problematic, depending on how that's communicated.
Oh, my Lord. Well, Emily, yeah.
Yeah.
One of the great parts of working with kids for as many years as I did is identifying the value of the why question. The why question of, I think we're entitled to know why something is the way it is within reason, and giving good rationale. And when the rationale doesn't make sense, being able, in concert with the person who asked the question, to say, well, that's a great question. And maybe it doesn't need to be this way.
Right.
And then problem solving together. There's the other side of the why question, which I often get asked the why question. Well, why? And the why question from many of my kids has been more about, well, I really don't want to do this. I'm going to keep asking for rationale because it allows me to no longer engage with what you're asking me to do. And when the rationale's been really well identified, right, and it's valid and it's meaningful, that why question is just sort of a detour. So helping parents and teachers and folks identify when is it a detour and when is it actually exploratory can be really helpful because, it's not always clear.
One of the things with my clients too, when we have those questions, a lot of it sometimes is explaining the why, but also recognizing what is our ability to change that? Because we don't always have a lot of ability to change it. So then from a neurodiversity affirming perspective, like recognizing here are the power hierarchies in the educational system. And here are the things that you have some control over and things that you don't. And we can do some accommodations. We can ask for things to be different. But in another sense, there are some things that this is the system, unfortunately, for right now, that we have to operate within. To me, when I'm working to build that affirming framework, that information is key. If they understand what's happening and why, at least then they have some autonomy to even make some choices. It's a weird, both and situation sometimes, recognizing this is where we live. but we can still work to change them.
I think what you're describing is whether it's change within your environment, which change within your organization, or even within yourself, there are going to be periods of time where you have essential discomfort around the process and the progression. And sometimes it's more about helping people navigate the experience as they're going through it and normalizing, again, I use the word, but finding a way to accept the fact that I'm going to be uncomfortable in a process. The process will be uncomfortable because of the time it takes, the number of people who are behind the change that needs to be made, or whether or not it's going to require political or cultural or other forms of change. And change is a brave act. People become remarkably comfortable in their level of discomfort if they just sit in it long enough. And it's shocking to a lot of folks. It's like, well, I can be comfortable in this negative state that I'm in because it's all I've known.
It's what I'm used to.
Yeah. And it's remarkable what people can become used to. So, I think there's definitely a coping aspect to that comes into play. And we have to say, okay, if we're helping someone cope with something in the process of change or in the process of just experiencing their world, that has value. Because the greater tolerance you have for frustration, the more likely you are to persevere through difficult things and have the opportunity to thrive. That's a big word in my company, is the idea of thriving, right? How do we help people thrive?
Yeah.
And I think more often than not, rather than solving your problem, is learning how to be aware and learning how to be able to tolerate frustration as part of the human experience. And I think that's something that we actually do very little of culturally these days, less so than maybe was present when I was a kid, for sure.
Reflecting on what you were just saying, it's interesting how sometimes people would rather stay in the discomfort that they know than take the risk of something that's unfamiliar. And I think that's not just a neurodivergent trait. I think that's across the board.
That's a human trait for sure.
So you and I are also both neurodivergent ourselves. And were you diagnosed when you were young or as an adult? Like, what was that experience like for you?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I was diagnosed as an adult. So put myself in context. And I don't do this for any other reason other than to give myself grace. I'm 53. I'm from an era of coping with my world by being outside, running around, being active. So as a kid, the concept of ADHD as a kid in the 70s living in the city was really not a thing. There was mischievous kids. There were, boys will be boys. And I think we maintain that part of culture continuously. The big challenge for me is that I was not overtly hyperactive or naughty in my behaviors. So being a window watcher, being a kid who I had a rich internal life, as I would say. Lots of things going on with my hummingbirds and flowers in my head going a mile a minute. And unfortunately, I did not get a lot of support. And it became very difficult. The stigma of being that underachiever, needing to have worked harder, and being held responsible for things that my neurology wasn't developmentally ready for. And that was incredibly challenging. And I think finding out in adulthood was purely coincidental. I didn't have anyone who actively said, have you ever thought that maybe you have ADHD? Or because it wasn't part of the culture in my home. I'm convinced my 90-year-old mother has ADHD. And so when you live amongst hummingbirds, this is what you do. You flit around and you change topics and you have strong emotional reactions in your home.
Right.
This was my typical. So I didn't have any reason to think it was unusual because I didn't get in trouble. I wasn't high on anybody's alert.
Yeah.
So that process of finding out in adulthood was unusual for me.
Why did you seek a diagnosis? What made you start realizing that was what was going on?
Well, as I was, as someone who started studying psychology in college, I was finding that there were a lot of things that were really difficult for me. And I realized that most of my strategies were found by happenstance. I stumbled across something. I also have fine motor challenges and some coordination challenges in terms of fine motor coordination. So for paper and pencil work was extremely difficult for me. I have a lot of, you and I will talk on a regular basis in our group. And in our consultation group, there are the talkers. And then, there are the listeners who bring things together really quickly and concisely. And when it comes to sharing ideas, if you put a pencil in my hand and say, can you share that idea? I'm going to give you wide-eyed stares and I'm going to have difficulty. luckily, as someone who has maybe a touch of dysgraphia myself, when the personal computer came into play, it changed my life dramatically. My parents had enough means to get me a desktop machine, an Okie Dad, a printer that could print stuff out for me and annoy my roommates, because I always printed it really late at night because I was always procrastinating.
And it was one of those loud, like, zzz,
oh,
the dot matrix.
Yeah, somewhere between the sound of a humming hive of bees and machine guns, depending upon if you put it on a hollow metal desk in a dorm room. It isn't quite as soothing as the bees.
Yeah.
But yeah, those things dramatically changed my life because I could type and I could get my ideas out. So my blue books with 2 pages of scrawl became, multi-pages of printed material that actually looked like somebody who had a good set of ideas in his head. And I started to learn strategies for organization as a 20-something that really, once I started to read about inattentive ADHD, really echoed with me. And I realized, wait a second, I'm one of many in that regard. And that was a relief, and I learned strategies, but most of it came in the absence of professional support. So I eventually investigated medication for myself with great reluctance. Because as a young person, I really didn't think I needed it because I used a lot of physical strategies. I was active in all the moments between. And when you get into adulthood, there's not those opportunities when they take away your recess and say, no, now you'll have another period of classes. And you go, if I don't have PE every day as a college student, that was tough. So I had to find other ways to really channel that energy that my body needed to expend to be focused.
What was the hesitation about medication?
I'm biased. I'll just say it flat out. I'm biased about the idea of taking a medication that alters my biochemistry is something that I take with great care. The idea that if something could affect my brain in a way that could feel unreversible or could feel beyond my control. And I like being in control of my own faculties and my own skills. So I did it with reluctance. I did it with lots of reading behind it, and I did it with a plan. I had a plan for understanding if I took a medication, I had side effects, I was going to give it a certain number of days and monitor my side effects and see what's the benefit. And if I saw a benefit, then I would look at it and see how it worked for me over time. So it was quite the endeavor. I had to really consider that with great care.
Yeah.
And it's not for everybody.
No.
For me, I think the best approach to thinking about medications was the conversations I had with parents. I talk about medications the same way I approach conversations about the money you have in your bank, your politics, and your religion. They're extremely personal. They're value-driven ideas, and they're things that you as a family are entitled to hold in whatever way you see fit. The only thing I will challenge with families therapeutically is if your child isn't benefiting and they're in pain and they have a worsening array of functioning that is going to affect them long term. I will often say to them, I'd like to show you what I see in the data about your child. So over time, if we think we need to do something differently, that we at least leave some options on the table for helping that child get what they need. Because the reality is, the longer you go without addressing your learning and thinking difference, whether it's ADHD or dyslexia, the greater probability you have of experiencing mental health concerns. And I think that's a very real finding in the data. We at Understood did a research study back towards year 2 of the pandemic, and that was a common finding. Kids with learning and thinking differences were having significantly more mental health concerns because they weren't getting the care that they needed or not getting identified because they weren't in school to be seen.
Right.
So those are factors I think I take great care with.
More in a minute.
The Bell & Blank Center is a leader in talent development for students from elementary through university. Their Academy for Twice Exceptionality and their assessment and counseling clinic feature leading psychoeducational assessment, counseling services, resources, and consultation for parents and their children from preschool all the way through college. One of the best options for neurodivergent students is early entrance, and the Bucksbaum Early Entrance Academy at Bell & Blank is known around the globe as one of the best options for helping your child get an early head start on their education. Bucksbaum enables high school juniors and seniors who are ready for university-level work to skip their final years of high school and head straight to college. The Bell and Blank Center's Academy for Twice Exceptionality helps our neurodivergent college students to foster meaningful academic experiences and develop independence, social emotional maturity, communication skills, and career readiness. The Bell and Blank Center at bellandblank.org. That's BELINBLANK.org, or look for a link in the show notes. I know one of the areas that I'm super interested in, and you are too, is the impact of sensory needs on neurodivergent kids and adults. I mean, I think even people who aren't neurodivergent, but I think that's something that is not understood. You know, it's just kind of, I just think there's a lack of awareness about how much that impacts all of the things.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's really hard because kids can't always have the awareness to verbalize what's going on with that. What are some of the unexpected ways that you see sensory needs influencing neurodivergent people?
Well, let's take a step back. I mean, if we think about the human experience, and even if we think, let's think of this in the realm of ADHD. ADHD isn't just a pure diagnosis. It's more of a syndrome. It's a collection of symptoms reflecting how the brain and body respond to their environment. And if you think about what ADHD is in terms of just stimulus and response, let's talk about the electrical connections within the brain. What you have is an organism that receives sensation, and that means anything that comes through our senses. And we then in turn respond to those stimuli in a way that is different than neurotypical folks who have more similar ways of responding to stimulation. So the idea that the brain of someone with ADHD might be naturally understimulated means that they're more reactive to things around them. So if I'm sitting in a fairly quiet room, as someone who's neurodivergent, I'm going to pick up on a lot of those irrelevant noises, and that's going to take me away from the important things in my environment. So on the very stereotypical side, when we see learning and social functioning, that distractibility, that desire of the brain to grab that stimuli is a huge interference in that process. That being said, people don't think about it in terms of, tactile. What does your body feel like? Having worked with kids on the autism spectrum for years, I was always in tune with that. And being, I see the overlaps at times between the sensation and perception differences of ADHD and autism as having a lot more overlap than most people. So I'll give you a personal example. I have sensory sensitivities to sensations around my neck. Okay, so for example, you'll never catch me in a turtleneck. It makes me absolutely want to remove my head and attach it somewhere else. If something was to touch my neck, if I spill a drink on the way to work and it dribbles down my neck to the collar of my shirt, I've got to make a really important decision. Am I going back home to get changed? Because I don't know if I'm going to be able to filter away that sensation. It's just, it just tortures me. So when it comes to understanding neurodivergent folks and sensation, it isn't just, I'm struggling to learn. I'm struggling to pay attention to that stuff in the classroom. It's actually about that massive competition in the environment for my brain's attention, whether it's what I feel with my body, whether it's what I hear, what I see. And again, that filtration, if you think about it, what is the primary goal of the human species? It's survival. Okay, as an organism, we're supposed to survive. So at some level, some parts of ADHD might be actually really helpful in the sense of I'm going to notice that change in my environment that could be bringing danger very quickly. So for an ADHD person, my wife actually doesn't mind when I drive at night or when we drive up to camp because I see the animals first. I see the changes in the road conditions really rapidly. And I see she's like, why do you always see the deer? Why do you always, I said, that's what turns my brain on.
Yeah, right.
My brain picks that stuff. So those differences in overall sensation and reaction and reactivity are a huge part of this. So I think that, what people misunderstand the most is that a sensory system needs to be regulated. If someone is dysregulated in terms of their response to their environment, you could forget learning and socialization in a positive way. So you're going to see bodies looking to cope or looking to grab stimuli to help them regulate their bodies. So when someone says to me, well, I just can't get them to sit still. And then my first question is, why do you need them to sit still? And then you get the look like the dog who turns their head to the odd sound. And I'm like, is it that when they move, it distracts you or the kids around them? And if the head shake and that's yes, then I say, okay, can we position or provide that individual an opportunity to get their body's needs met without disrupting the needs of the others? And can we think about that more globally? Because I'm going to guess that's not just an ADHD thing. That's a human neurological thing. I shouldn't have to be diagnosed with something to have someone think about my needs more globally. Mm-hmm. And those are the kind of things that I'm always thinking about. And that each neurological system's different. The idea that every kid with ADHD should be in the front of the room by the teacher, that doesn't make any sense to me.
Right.
For me, that was a nightmare. It would happen on occasion. I'd have a teacher who would tune in to me and say, I'm going to help you. I'm putting you right up front so you don't miss anything. And what I say now looking back is, you're wrong. I'm missing everything because everything's behind me. Mm-hmm. All the things that I'm responding to are behind me. You're unfortunately the least interesting thing in my neurology. So I'm on a swivel and, not being mean, it's just how my brain works.
Yeah.
So I was on a swivel, looking behind me, turning my head. I mean, my neck was hurting at the end of the second day of being in the front of the room. So you can't assume every neurological system needs the same thing. You just have to be aware of, how can I help that human be successful with what their body is demanding? Mm-hmm. And I think that teachers are doing an incredible job in the day-to-day figuring these things out. I see so many great teachers creating movement activities for their kids, trying to be aware of the sensory environment, because it's not a pathology. Mm-hmm. It's a difference in wiring. It's a difference in neurological functioning. And it doesn't have to be pathology unless the environment makes it ineffective. And that's a changeable thing.
One of the things I'm always really sensitive to is sounds specifically, like it's kind of what you were just saying, but also as I travel and speak, like sleeping in an unfamiliar environment is the worst. So it's like, I have my earplugs, I've got my white noise machine, like I bring my Bluetooth speaker. Yeah. And I know when I was in the classroom teaching, sometimes teachers would play like music in the classroom, which could be helpful, but also sometimes it just depends on the child. But then sometimes there's this pushback, especially for kids like my son, who's a freshman. When he came home from school at the beginning of the year, one of the syllabi that he had from one of his teachers was like, no headphones, no earbuds ever under any. And I'm like, well, that's a reasonable accommodation. What are some of your thoughts about that particular sensory need with helping people either focus or kind of reduce that stimuli that impacts them?
That's like my life in a nutshell. I think that navigating the sensory world through those kind of strategies is something that is incredibly important to investigate with folks. And you have to experiment with it. The things that work for you in one moment might not work for you in another. And I think that, people assume that like, okay, white noise is going to do this thing for me and I'm going to function when I have it. And when I don't, I won't function. And I don't think there's necessarily... unless we're going to do neurological studies to look at brain imaging, what we'd probably see if we did brain imaging is the idea that there are at least two theories that we function on. One is called the optimum stimulation level theory. And it's an old theory. It's a theory from back in the 60s that the human organism or the individual is intrinsically motivated to accomplish and meet a certain specific level of stimulation so that they can have an optimum level of awareness of what's going on around them. So someone might, like a child with ADHD who's somewhat hyperactive, may engage in physical activity to bring their stimulation level up to reach this equilibrium or homeostasis. And so for many of us, bringing in white noise, bringing in the noise blocking earphones are ways that a lot of people will use to try to regulate that homeostatic mode in their body. That doesn't often take into account if you enter an environment and you're at a higher level or lower level of stimulation than you were the day before, someone might make the assumption, well, that doesn't work for you. And so for me, we would have these conversations a lot. I was a consultant in schools for over 17 years. And one of the great battles was always around, can we let kids wear their headphones? Can we let kids, block out some of the stimuli? And my mindset in a general rule was, why don't we have experiments? If the data supports that this works for you, then we will support that we're going to give you that opportunity. But if you're going to put on headphones, here are the parameters. And people who know me would have heard me say this a half dozen times a week. First, the noise from your headphones cannot be audible to people in your immediate vicinity. 2, as much as you love what you're listening to, you cannot be rapping, singing along, tapping along, and recreating the rhythms. And 3, I must be able to observe some level of engagement or productivity. Okay. If those 3 things are in check, you can continue to have that privilege to do what you need to do. If you are not successful in that day, you might be asked by the teacher, hey, this doesn't look like it's working today. Let's put it away for now and try something else. And if there was a disagreement, the phrase that we would use, and it was very common for a lot of my kids on the spectrum, was, the data doesn't support that this is working for you today. Okay. And we would talk about that therapeutically. What is the data? Are you engaged in the way you're supposed to? Are you doing what's being asked of you? And are you allowing others around you to work? And when the answer is no, no, and no, it's like, well, there's the logic. We need to make a choice. So that was a really big deal. The idea around what people choose to use, I think, is very, very interesting, because there's a lot of great developing research on how the brain is registering and using information and noise. You talk about white noise for you, Emily. I've used white noise when I travel. I just traveled to work last week. I was in Manhattan. And for me, I grew up in New York. So actually being in New York in a busy city hotel with outside noise from the streets actually helps me sleep really well. Something about it works for me. When I moved up here to Maine, where it's extremely quiet, I found it really difficult at first, almost creepy. And then I used brown noise to sleep just because it was a preferred frequency for me. And again, what the active ingredient there was, I had no idea. I was using it because I liked the sound. So, I think, we could go down that rabbit hole. We could talk about that in detail if you like, but I think that people's neurological systems absolutely can benefit from sensory tools. I did an entire talk some years back on non-medication approaches to ADHD, and we spent almost half the day talking about sensory approaches, helping to modulate the body. And I found that for parents and families who really didn't want to use meds or wanted to make it part of their toolbox, having those strategies were great because they had control, something they could choose. They could use it one time or not another. And people want control. So giving them more strategies and tools, I think, is always a good thing.
I know that a lot of the work that you do with Understood involves that parenting piece. And like Understood, is really focused on helping parents find community and connection. Obviously, there's a lot of value there. I mean, I feel like that's what the podcast is doing too, right? Helping people have that sense of universality just with whatever it is that they're going through. What are some of the things that you have seen progressing in that area that you feel like have been really useful, or are there certain things that you guys are doing at Understood that have been really helpful as well?
I think the term community is a huge piece of this, because when people are struggling with daily functioning, it is the most isolating thing. When you find that your child is either being called out for misbehaving or not getting the things that they need, the number one thing you experience is isolation. And as a parent, not all parents are going to have the background that you or I have. So the idea of finding community, talking to other parents, getting access to good information. In the last year, I'm really excited. We just created a new app called Wonder, and that's spelled with a U. And it's really sort of a cool little app. It's a free app. It allows parents to connect with one another around their kids' learning and thinking differences. And we have a variety of community groups where experts will, jump on and answer questions, do a variety of weekly posts about, things like, hey, we're coming up on the holidays. What kind of strategies are helpful for you navigating this with your family? And then it all toggles back quite nicely to understood.org, which we have so many resources for families and educators and individuals to help them really work towards understanding themselves, becoming compassionate, parenting in a way that feels consistent with how they want to live their lives, and really helping people thrive across the lifespan. One of the things for me that was so important, having worked with kids in schools for so many years, and prior to that working with a lot of adults, is that I think that the K-12 world, the pre-K to 12 world, often doesn't think about the lifespan development of a human. And I think that for me, I'm always thinking about, how can we help someone through each of those key moments in their lives? How do we navigate transitions and move on to become self-advocating? How do we advocate and ask for accommodations we need going to college or going to the workplace? And how do we help people within the workplace help to leverage the idea that, wow, there's so many neurodivergent folks who can benefit from some really simple, inexpensive tweaks to the work environment, and that it expands the workforce with really talented and engageable people who are being absolutely underemployed right now. So for me, those are the biggest things about, what drives me to work at Understood. And the idea that right now, doing work like this where you and I get to talk is about expanding our reach.
Mm-hmm.
I love chatting with families and folks in IEP meetings and going to school trainings. But when you can get out and put something on the web that people can access at their leisure, that they can download, that they can share, it allows something to have a much longer lifespan than just a handful of conversations. So, those things really drive what I do in the day-to-day.
I was listening to a podcast the other day. I honestly can't remember which one it was off the top of my head, but you mentioned about employment changes. And it was talking about how the pandemic has disrupted employment so much. And actually, for the first time that we've ever had any big economical shift, people with disabilities have recovered more quickly than people without because of the embracing of work at home.
Yeah.
And how that's just become so normalized. And it's opened up all of these employment opportunities for people. And it just shows how a cultural shift, the more we can make the world accessible, it's going to be better for really all people.
Oh, it's so important. And I like that word disruption.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe it's the revolutionary in my head that says disruption can be such a good thing. The challenge, Emily, and I think this is maybe a big call to action today, is that disruption let employers feel a level of discomfort that they'd never experienced before. And employers who are learning from that disruption and trying to create better workplace, expand their workforce, and value their workers in a way that they hadn't before are going to see that, wow, we had tremendous learnings from this. Unfortunately, I'm getting a lot of messaging from folks who are seeing that their employers are now pushing very hard to go back to work in their locations, in their buildings.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're seeing is a massive increase in anxiety and discomfort for neurodivergent folks who are, like we talked about earlier with kids, asking the why question.
Mm-hmm.
If we're successful and productive and engaged in a way that allows the company to be successful, why are we forcing ourselves back into the buildings and losing the things that made us successful as neurodivergent folks in our work? And the answer from, unfortunately, the companies that are not learning from the disruption is that, well, that's because what we've always done. And maybe the subtext is follow the money. I have a building with rent.
Right.
I've got a price per square foot in my building that I have to justify to my corporate entities. And I think there's nothing more disruptive than losing chunks of your workforce to this. And I think we're going to see both sides of that.
Mm-hmm.
Companies who are very aware and seeing the benefit of disruption and seeing the comfort of their workforce and the productivity increase, hopefully are going to see this improve for folks who are neurodivergent. But I think the other side of that coin is people who just want to get back to, again, we're going to dovetail back into the word normal, are going to miss out on some great learnings.
Dr. Andy Kahn of understood.org, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks so much for having me. I love having these conversations with you.
It's always encouraging to see the progress that's being made with the professionals who understand neurodiversity. From doctors to educators to mental health professionals, we're starting to see those changes. Even the service industry and tourism are finding ways to make accommodations available within their spaces. The young neurodivergent people who are growing up today will eventually bring the things that they've learned about themselves and how to advocate to the workplace, and the progress will continue. I know on an individual level, it can often feel like there are a lot of roadblocks to reaching that neurodiversity-affirming world. But when I zoom out, I can see the progress that's being made, and that gives me so much hope. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
So I've asked OpenAI's ChatGPT to write the closing credits in the styling of William Shakespeare. And credit where credit is due, it's pretty good. Consider that tough love being harsh for ChatGPT's benefit. First, our thanks for sponsoring this episode to the Bell and Blank Center at the University of Iowa at bellandblank.org. with programs and resources to support neurodiverse students and their families. Okay, so without further ado, here it is. Again, written 100% by ChatGPT from OpenAI. And so, as the curtain doth fall, our time with Dr. Andy Kahn draws to an end. We bid thee adieu, good doctor, for sharing thy wisdom and knowledge with us. But let us not forget the players upon this stage who make this podcast possible. Our fair host, Emily Kircher-Morris, who doth guide us through each episode with poise and eloquence. Our office manager and social media director, Krista Brown, who doth keep the wheels turning behind the scenes. And our executive producer, Dave Morris, who doth bring this project to life and is reading this right now. We are filled with gratitude for the toil and trouble of each and every one of you. Farewell for now, dear friends, and we shall meet again upon the morrow for another episode of the Neurodiversity Podcast. Until then, partings are such sweet sorrow. Thanks, ChatGPT. That was pretty cool. This is a service of the Neurodiversity Alliance.